8 blessings. Exactly one sentence repeats between them. Not a virtue, not a reward, the closing line itself. The first beatitude and the 8th end on the identical Greek words. Not similar, identical. The 6 blessings sitting between them never repeat anything at all. Most people can recite 1 or 2 of the Beatitudes, usually the gentlest sounding ones. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, without ever noticing they all open on the same word 8 times in a row, or that the whole passage is bracketed shut by a matching pair of closing lines almost nobody quotes on purpose. Fewer still have ever heard all 8 recited in order. One word opening every line, one repeated sentence closing the first and the last. That's not 2 separate quirks of the Greek, it's a frame. And the 6 blessings sitting inside it are doing something most readers never suspect. The ordinary way to read the Beatitudes treats them as loose lists, 8 separate independent promises, each rewarding a different virtue, the way a syllabus might list 8 unrelated topics under one course title. Poor in spirit gets the kingdom, those who mourn get comfort, the meek get the earth. Read that way, the passage functions as 8 small transactions. Be this way, receive that reward, move to the next line, repeat. That reading isn't unreasonable on its face. Each line does, after all, name a distinct quality and a distinct promise, and nothing in a quick read signals that they're supposed to be held together rather than admired one at a time. Most sermons on the Beatitudes take exactly this approach. 8 mini-lessons, sometimes preached across 8 separate weeks, 1 virtue and 1 reward per sitting. There's a second related habit that compounds the problem, treating the list as a checklist of virtues to individually acquire in whichever order feels most urgent this year. Work on meekness this season, mercy the next, purity of heart whenever there's time. Self-help culture is comfortable with lists like that. Pick the item that speaks to you, apply it, move on. The Beatitudes get absorbed into that same shape easily because on the surface they look like exactly that kind of list. 8 virtues, 8 matching rewards, pick your favorite. But treating them as 8 independent transactions quietly erases something the original structure goes out of its way to preserve. If the passage really were 8 unrelated promises, there would be no obvious reason for the first and the last to share their ending word for word, while the 6 in between all use different endings. That kind of repetition doesn't happen by accident in a carefully composed teaching, and it doesn't happen in a text this heavily shaped and remembered. Something is holding these 8 lines together on purpose, and the ordinary 1 blessing at a time reading walks straight past it every time.
Here's the concrete, countable thing sitting inside these 8 lines that gets lost when they're read as a loose list. There's a single word opening every one of the 8, the same word 8 times, not a synonym rotated in for variety. And there's a second, quieter pattern running underneath it. The exact sentence that closes line 1 is the exact sentence that closes line 8, word for word in the Greek, while none of the 6 sentences between them repeat at all. 1 word tying all 8 openings together. 1 repeated sentence tying the first and the last closings together. That's not decoration, that's architecture. If a passage this famous has been hiding a deliberate literary frame in plain sight for 2,000 years of quotation, that's exactly the kind of thing worth a like, so more people run into the actual shape of it instead of just the 1 or 2 lines everyone already knows by heart. And if there's someone in your life who only ever quotes, "Blessed are the meek," without knowing it's one piece of an 8-piece frame, this is worth sending them too. Start with the word itself because it's doing more work than the English translation lets on. Makarios gets rendered blessed in nearly every English Bible, but in the wider Greek world outside the New Testament, the word had a very specific job. It described the untroubled, self-sufficient contentment of the gods, a state entirely unbothered by ordinary human misfortune, not because the gods were lucky, but because their condition sat above the reach of luck altogether. When Greek writers wanted to describe a mortal enjoying that same elevated, secure kind of well-being, usually the very wealthy or the dead who had passed beyond further misfortune, Makarios was the word they reached for, distinct from the more common word for simple good luck or happiness, ptōchos. Makarios wasn't about how someone felt walking around on a given afternoon. It was about their objective standing, safely settled, regardless of feeling. Jesus takes that word and hands it 8 times over to exactly the people Greek usage would never have applied it to: the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, the hungry, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted. Every category on the list is a category the ancient world associated with vulnerability, not security. Applying the God's contentment word to grieving, hungry, persecuted people isn't a soft compliment. It's a status announcement delivered with real force to people the culture around them would have assumed were anything but Makarios. Look closer at the very first category, because the Greek sharpens it further than the English poor quite manages. Matthew's Greek uses Ptōchos, not the milder penēs. Penēs described someone of modest means, working, scraping by, but self-sufficient. Ptōchos described someone with nothing at all, reduced to begging, entirely dependent on what someone else chose to give. Greek had a word for ordinary poverty and a separate, harsher word for utter destitution, and Matthew reaches for the harsher one. Poor in spirit isn't describing people with modest, humble self-assessments. It's describing people who have run entirely out of spiritual resources of their own to draw on. Beggars, not budgeters, which makes the promise attached to it land harder. Not theirs will eventually be, but theirs already is the kingdom of heaven, handed to people with nothing left to offer in exchange for it.
Run quickly through what each of the 8 actually promises, because the specificity matters. The poor in spirit get the kingdom of heaven, present tense, verse 3. Those who mourn get comfort, verse 4. The meek inherit the earth, verse 5, itself an echo of Psalm 37:11, which promises the same land inheritance to the meek centuries earlier. So Jesus isn't inventing new vocabulary here. He's picking up an existing scriptural promise and folding it into his own list. The hungry and thirsty for righteousness get filled, verse 6. The merciful obtain mercy, verse 7. A promise built on a matching verb, mercy answered with mercy, rather than with some unrelated reward. The pure in heart see God, verse 8. The boldest promise on the list, direct, unmediated sight of God, tied specifically to purity rather than to strength or status. The peacemakers are called sons of God, verse 9, family language rather than reward language. And the persecuted for righteousness' sake receive, again, the kingdom of heaven, present tense, closing the frame exactly where it opened.
Now the frame. Matthew 5:3 ends, "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Skip down 6 lines, past the comforted mourners, the earth inheriting meek, the filled hungry, the mercy obtaining merciful, the God seeing pure in heart, and the child of God called peacemakers, and Matthew 5:10 ends, "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Same 9 words, same order, same tense in the Greek text as it's actually written. Verses 4 through 9 all use a different grammatical tense for their promise, future. They shall be comforted, they shall inherit, they shall be filled.
Verses 3 and 10 alone sit in the present tense. Theirs is, not theirs shall be. 2 present tense brackets holding 6 future tense mivals. This kind of frame has a name in the study of ancient literature: Inclusio, a technique where an author opens and closes a unit with matching language specifically to mark everything inside as one connected whole. The way a paragraph's first and last sentence sometimes echo each other on purpose. Genesis itself uses the technique at a much larger scale, opening and closing entire sections of its own text with matching phrases. Matthew's Beatitudes use it in miniature across just 8 lines, and the effect is precise. Everything between the two "theirs is the kingdom of heaven" bookends: comfort, land, satisfaction, mercy, the vision of God, the title of God's own children, isn't a separate reward running alongside the kingdom. It's what the kingdom actually consists of, itemized 6 different ways, with the frame announcing at both ends that all of it is already, presently, theirs.
Worth being straightforward where the passage's honest textual complication sits, rather than smoothing it over. Luke's Gospel records a shorter, related version of this teaching in Luke 6:20-26. 4 blessings rather than 8, addressed directly in the second person: "Blessed are you, not blessed are they," and paired with 4 matching woes that Matthew's version doesn't include at all. Scholars differ on whether Luke and Matthew are recording the same original sermon condensed and expanded differently, 2 separate occasions where Jesus taught overlapping material, or a shared source each gospel writer shaped toward his own audience. This video isn't going to settle that question. What's secure is Matthew's own internal structure, the 8-fold Makarios, the matching present tense frame, which holds together as a deliberate unit regardless of how it relates to Luke's shorter version. So here's what the passage is actually built to say once the word and the frame both get tracked instead of skimmed. Makarios was never a word for a passing mood. It was a status word, reserved in its wider Greek usage for the untroubled, secure standing of the gods themselves, then handed by Jesus 8 times in a row with real deliberateness to grieving people, hungry people, persecuted people, exactly the categories the ancient world would have assumed were furthest from that kind of standing. And the frame holding those 8 declarations together, present tense at the start, present tense at the end, future tense carrying everything in between, announces that the whole list is one thing, not 8, a single description of what it means to already belong to the kingdom of heaven, unpacked from 6 different angles, with the mourning and the meekness and the hunger and the persecution all folded into the same secured status, rather than functioning as 8 separate transactions, each earning its own separate prize.
The single word ties the 8 openings together. The single repeated sentence ties the 2 ends together. And what sits between those 2 brackets isn't 8 rewards, it's one kingdom, described 8 ways. The same instinct to frame a teaching with matching bookends shows up elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, which makes the Beatitudes structure look less like an isolated literary flourish and more like a technique this Gospel writer reaches for deliberately. The Lord's Prayer, delivered by Matthew just 1 chapter later, in 6:9-13, opens by addressing Our Father, and moves through a structured sequence of petitions before closing on themes of deliverance and God's kingdom, a shape many readers have long noticed loosely echoes the Beatitudes' own movement from spiritual poverty toward the full possession of God's kingdom.
though this parallel is looser and more thematic than the tight verbal inclusio framing 5:3 and 5:10. A tighter, more verifiable parallel sits inside Matthew's own record of Jesus' final words. Matthew 28:20 closes the entire gospel with Jesus promising, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." And Matthew 1:23, at the gospel's opening, introduces Jesus by translating his prophesied name, Emmanuel, as God with us. A presence promise opens Matthew's gospel, and a presence promise closes it. The same inclusio technique operating at the scale of an entire 28-chapter book rather than 8 verses. Whether or not Matthew's audience was trained to consciously spot inclusio the way a modern literary scholar would name it, the technique's repeated appearance across such different scales of his own writing, one paragraph, one gospel, suggests it wasn't an accident here or there. It was simply how this particular writer built things that needed to be remembered as a whole, rather than picked apart line by line.
The word Makarios itself doesn't stop at Matthew 5. James' letter, writing to a scattered, struggling audience decades later, reaches for the same word twice in ways that confirm it was never meant as a description of a passing mood. James 1:12 says, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life." Makarios attached to someone actively enduring hardship, not someone who has already escaped it, the reward still future, the status already present. James 1:25 applies the same word to someone who hears God's word and actually does it, calling that person blessed in his deed. Makarios tied to a settled condition arising from a life shaped a certain way, not to an emotional high point. 2 more data points from a different New Testament author writing to a different audience, both using the word exactly the way Matthew 5 uses it, a fixed, declared status, not a feeling anyone is required to be having in the moment they receive it. Here's what this means for the way most people already carry this passage around, usually as one favorite line, quietly detached from the other 7. If the frame is real, then quoting "Blessed are the meek" on its own, the way it usually gets quoted, isn't wrong exactly, but it's a little like reading one sentence from the middle of a paragraph and treating it as the whole paragraph's point. The meek aren't promised the earth as a standalone transaction, separate from whatever happened to the poor in spirit 2 lines earlier. Both promises, and the 4 sitting between them, are being held inside the same frame, describing facets of one secured status rather than 8 competing errands to complete. Mourning isn't a separate assignment from hungering after righteousness. They're 2 views of the same kingdom from 2 different rooms of the same house. If you've got someone in your life who only knows this passage as one comforting line pulled out of context, usually whichever one matched what they were going through at the time, this is worth sending them the fuller shape of, not because the one line was wrong to hold on to, but because it was never meant to carry the weight alone. 8 lines, 1 frame, 1 kingdom already theirs at both ends of the list. That's worth having in full, not just the piece that happened to land first.
It's worth sitting, too, with what the frame does for the categories that feel least like accomplishments. Nobody sets out to mourn. Nobody schedules persecution. Those 2 entries on the list, verse 4 and verse 10, describe things that happen to a person, not things a person achieves through effort, the way meekness or mercy might at least sound achievable. And yet the frame doesn't rank them lower.
The persecuted get the exact same present tense promise as the poor in spirit did at the opening, not a lesser echo of the kingdom, the same kingdom, stated in the same tense, closing the same bracket. If part of your life right now looks less like an achieved virtue and more like something that simply happened to you, grief you didn't choose, opposition you didn't provoke, the frame was built wide enough to hold that inside it too, not off to the side as a lesser case. Video named Jesus Said I Am 8 times in one gospel, and the 8th time made soldiers fall backward on this channel, walked through 8 different moments Jesus used a specific phrase about himself, each one building toward the same identity claim from a different angle, the same kind of structure in a very different passage. Worth watching if this pattern of one truth counted out 8 separate times is the kind of thing you keep noticing once you start looking for it. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. One word, Makarios, opening all 8 lines, not a mood word, a status word, borrowed from the vocabulary the ancient world once reserved for the untroubled contentment of the gods, and handed instead to the poor in spirit, the mourning, the persecuted. One sentence, repeated exactly, line 1 and line 8, present tense on both ends. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, holding 6 future tense promises inside it like a set of hands cupped around something already given. 6 different facets in between: comfort, land, satisfaction, mercy, the vision of God, the name of God's own children, each one a different room in the same house, not 6 separate houses.
And underneath all of it, the same architectural habit showing up again at the scale of Matthew's entire gospel. A presence promise opening the book, a presence promise closing it 28 chapters later. The same hands cupped around the same kind of gift. Picture 2 bookends carved with the identical inscription, holding up 6 volumes that don't match each other on the surface, one about grief, one about hunger, one about persecution, until you notice the bookends and realize every volume between them was always describing the same shelf. If you've quoted one of these 8 lines your whole life without ever noticing it was standing inside a 2,000-year-old frame built specifically to hold it up, that's not a failure of attention. The frame is easy to miss precisely because English translations preserve the words but not the tense pattern or the exact repetition that makes it visible in the first place. Tell us in the comments which of the 8 you'd always quoted on its own and whether it changes anything to see it sitting inside the full frame rather than standing alone. That's exactly the kind of thing worth talking through together. A like helps more people run into the full shape of this instead of just the one line they already knew. Subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this kind of structure, the one hiding in plain sight inside a passage everyone assumes they've already fully read. If you're watching this today, here's a word for you. Whatever you've been quietly waiting to feel like before you'd count yourself blessed, the frame was never waiting on your feelings to catch up. It was already standing on both ends of the list before you got there.